Thank you, Lana. Thank you, Travella. Thank you, guys, for the communion. And again, I just want to say good morning to everybody. I do want to acknowledge, sometimes I forget to do this, but the people that will be watching online. So I'm very happy that you're joining us. I hope that you will visit sometime soon in the near future here at the location. So anyway, today, as we begin the new year, we're also beginning a brand new series that I hope that we can all learn from and grow from. And the series idea and the title that I came up with a couple of years ago, actually, when I was kind of in a somewhat silly and creative mood. And humorously, I entitled it Flat Squirrels. Now, for those of you that are animal lovers and are sensitive to that, I apologize if I offended you in that way. But as you can guess, the idea comes from the many times, I don't know about you, and I'm sure it's happened to you, but as well it has to me, that squirrels have darted out in front of me. And instead of completing what they started and continuing the crossing the road, they somehow panicked, started overanalyzing, and failed to make a good decision. I guess, Richard, in your case, it should be flat deers, right? Yeah. So kind of got a pattern of that. But unfortunately, at times, the consequences for the squirrels, or the deers in that case, didn't end very well. And poor decision can leave us feeling like that, can't they? Like we just got run over by a Mack truck. This series is about discovering a path to making better decisions so that we don't end up being flat squirrels or feeling like flat squirrels. You know, every January, millions of people make a list of New Year's resolutions. And those resolutions are ideas or goals that they have set about making their life better, things that they want to resolve in their life. For many people, it's the same resolutions year in and year out, the same one they made last year and the year before that and the year before that. Like the flat squirrel, they start a path, they fail to complete it, and they just feel defeated and kind of go back to some old behaviors. Rarely, though, have I ever heard someone make a New Year's resolution about beginning to build a path to making better decisions. And while you might be one of those who feels like you make pretty good decisions, I would venture to say that this is an area where we can all improve on in one way or another. More specifically, though, this series is about learning God's pathway to making better decisions. And I realize that not everybody wants or believes in a spiritual or biblical pathway to making better decisions, but I believe that the path to making the kind of decisions that ensure the best quality of life that we were meant to have should come from the one who designed and created us. You know, the Bible is full of wisdom on the importance of making good decisions. In it, God encourages, He equips, and He empowers us to make the sort of decisions that lead to the kind of abundant life that Jesus offered, and to live life with fewer regrets and remorse, or less remorse, I should say. For the follower of Jesus, making better decisions often translates into obedience to God's commands and His principle. It's a critical part of what Paul calls in Philippians 2, working out our salvation, or to put it another way, to respond to God's gift of grace in a way that honors His sacrifice, to make the most of the second chance that we've been given in life. It also means that we are growing in our ability to be receptive to the prompting and respond to the leadership of the Holy Spirit in our life. And that, of course, translates into character development. It reflects that we are growing in our discernment as well. Our ability to exercise what Paul calls in 1 Corinthians 2 as the mind of Christ. And better decisions help us to forsake sometimes those poor and sometimes destructive habits that we need to walk away from. But even more, it means that we drastically reduce or possibly even eliminate the potential to becoming enslaved by the consequences of those poor decisions. In many cases, that means we can avoid the completely unnecessary self-inflicted scars that often come as a result of those consequences. Unfortunately, with poor decisions, the consequences and the scars aren't always ours alone to bear. It's easy to forget that some decisions we make leave the kind of legacy we never envisioned. They leave a trail of destruction in their wake that we never thought about. They can cast a shadow on the lives of others, including those closer to us, for years and even decades or centuries to come. And with so much at stake in our responsibility to make better decisions in life, it's important to understand that some of the challenges to making good decisions, to good God-honoring decisions. And as I thought about some of those this week and began to write them down, it just seemed like there was no end to all the things that are working against us when it comes to making better decisions. And the interesting thing about many of these challenges is that there's often one or more stories in the Bible of people who made poor decisions because of them. It's one of the things I loved about the Bible. It doesn't hide from unsavory characters or even good characters who made bad decisions that often led to disastrous consequences. It doesn't sugarcoat anything for us. With that said, the first and the most obvious thing working against us is sin. Sin manifests itself in so many ways, but probably no more so than it does when it comes to selfishness. When we make decisions based only on or primarily about how it best serves our own need, we are completely missing the mark on the opportunity we're being given with that decision. Every decision we face, especially if we proclaim to be a follower of Jesus, is a test. When the primary motivation behind our decision is self-serving, self-elevating, or self-rewarding, then we failed that test. There are countless examples of this in Scripture, but probably the most famous example is the severe lapse of judgment of King David, when a sideways glance turned into a much longer stare from a palace roof at a woman taking a bath across the street. King David was in a position of power, and he used that power to seduce and sleep with a woman who was not his wife, a woman who was married to another man of honor who was on the battlefield where David should have been at the time. But in a moment of selfishness, he refused to consider the repercussions, and he sinned by not only committing adultery with Bathsheba, but many other things as well, which eventually led to all the catastrophic consequences that he dealt with. In his letter to the church of Galatia, Paul wrote that if we decide to live under the direction of the Holy Spirit, that we won't do what the sin in us wants to do. But if we make decisions that are all about self-satisfaction, we will reap the consequences of those decisions. Along the same line of sin, the second thing we have working against us is our innate capacity to deceive ourselves, right? Or to sell ourselves on making bad decisions. Jeremiah kind of conveyed this thought in the most profound way in Jeremiah 17. He says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it?" How many times have you asked yourself, I know I have, how many times have you asked yourself, what in the world was I thinking when I made this decision or that decision? Or maybe you've looked in the mirror and thought, who is this person looking back at me? Why am I doing the things that I'm doing? I don't know about you, but I've had that thought many times. And if it's any consolation, we're not alone. Paul spends almost 10 verses in kind of playing out this perplexing dilemma in his own mind as he's writing down a letter to the church of Rome. In Romans chapter 7, he goes on and on about how he often does the things he doesn't want to do, and the things he wants to do or should do, he doesn't do. And he doesn't do the things he knows that he should do. Ever had that same conversation with yourself? I mean, man, why do I keep doing the things I don't want to do and don't do the things I know I should do? You know, the heart indeed is a mystery. And that's why I'll never understand how we can sit in judgment on someone else's motivations when we don't even know our own half the time. I mean, we don't even know our own heart or why it does what it does, yet somehow we never seem to have an issue judging someone else's motivation. The Lord, however, does know the hidden motivations of the heart. And as Jeremiah went on to point out, he made clear that he will indeed judge the world according to our actions and our motives. A third deterrent to making good decisions is our own sense of self-preservation. A familiar story for many of you that comes to mind is the story about Abraham in the Old Testament. You guys might remember this story, where he goes to a foreign country, and in order to kind of preserve his own life, he convinces his wife to tell the king of that country that she's his sister, not his wife. Remember that? And in order to kind of save his own skin. Instead of trusting God or seeking God's counsel in this predicament, he makes the decision to lie, and he subjected his wife to a possible compromise. To make matters worse, he did this not once but twice. And if that wasn't bad enough, later on his own son Isaac did the same thing to his wife. And another decision made out of desire to preserve oneself, Jesus encountered a young, wealthy, powerful man who wanted to balance his life with his wealth and all that stuff, with kind of adding a spiritual component to it. But instead of offering him balance, Jesus challenges him to upset the apple cart by selling all of his possessions and giving the money away. Like all decision-making opportunities, this was just a test. But in a decision made out of self-preservation, he failed the test when he refused, and he walked away realizing that Jesus' idea of an abundant life wasn't having the best of both worlds. Many times, making the better decision means that we have to make sacrifices. But if self-preservation is our strong go-to filter through which we make decisions, we will fail the test every time. Another common deterrent to good decision-making is pride. This one plays out in so many different ways. For example, it's pride that often turns one bad decision into a series of bad decisions instead of correcting course, right? I mean, we mentioned David already and his sin of adultery. But as you might recall, that decision ended up with Bathsheba being pregnant. And then instead of correcting the course, David set out to make a series of bad decisions, beginning with trying to con her husband into coming home and helping cover it all up by going in to sleep with his wife. That way nobody knew it was David's baby and not his. But when that didn't work, it led to another decision which ended up with the death of her husband Uriah, and eventually to the death of a newborn child. Pride also often leads us to assume that because we've been successful in something in the past, we're automatically going to be successful with it again in the future. As a result, sometimes we dive headlong into, without thinking about something, into making a decision because, hey, we've got it all under control, and besides, we've done it before. So therefore, it's going to be okay. We make a decision based on that assumption. Pride is also what makes us ignore good advice to consider in favor of finding people who will kind of tell us what we want to hear. Many of the scriptures we're going to look at throughout the next few weeks come from the book of Proverbs, written by the pen of Solomon. Now, these Proverbs were first written primarily for the benefit of his son Rehoboam, who would one day take over the kingdom. Many of the Proverbs will talk about giving good advice in the decision-making process. Yet when he became king, Rehoboam ignored the wise counsel of men who served his father, and instead he listened to a bunch of his buddies who had a lot less maturity and a lot less experience in life than even he himself did. And as a result, the decisions he made ultimately alienated the people of Israel, and it divided the country for thousands of years. He forgot or ignored what perhaps was his father's most well-known proverbial warning, that pride and arrogance lead to destruction. The bigger the ego, the harder the fall. Another factor that leads to poor decision-making is peer pressure, which can come from the desire to be for approval from our friends, or it can come from the fear of retaliation for not being agreeable. Now, I wasn't there, but it stands to reason that this is kind of what led Aaron to making the golden calf, right? You remember this story when Aaron is surrounded by a bunch of people who said, here, Moses isn't coming back. You need to make us a god. And so Aaron, under all this peer pressure and this incredible crowd gathering around him, intimidating him, he basically went along with it and then made up a story about how the golden calf just kind of appeared when he threw things into the fire, like that was reality. Now, I would venture to say that most of us have made some very unwise decisions or two for the very same reason in high school or junior high school. And unfortunately, even in our adult years, we're often influenced by a mob mentality, right? And we're often influenced by people who are all going one way, and we kind of seem to look the other way or want to lean the other way because we know it's smarter, but we just kind of give in and go along with the crowd. We do that as adults just as much as we do that as kids. That's why Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15 that bad company corrupts good morals and good decision-making, and to think about what is right and to avoid sinning. The book of Psalms opens up with a compliment for those who do not hang around with or follow the lead of those who can lead us down a destructive path by helping or encouraging us to make those decisions. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 13:20, "Walk with the wise and you'll become wise, but be a companion of fools and you will suffer harm." The reason why, because bad decisions breed bad decisions. Allowing people who have less knowledge and experience than ourselves to speak into our decisions, who themselves don't even seek God's own wisdom in their own processes, is a recipe for disastrous decisions to take root and to flourish in our own life. Another road to bad decision making is failing to properly assess a situation before making the decision. In perhaps one of the most infamous decisions ever made in Scripture, Abraham's nephew Lot was given a choice as to where he wanted to go when his resources for his growing business were becoming more and more limited. And thinking only about the fertile field that made for unlimited growth and expansion for his business and not thinking about anything else, he chose to go to a town called Sodom. Remember that sound? He never stopped to consider who his new neighbors would be or their reputation for being literally the most immoral and inhospitable people on the planet. The decision ultimately led to nothing but grief and chaos for Lot and for his family for generations to come. Have you ever made a decision without considering all the facts or properly assessing the situation thoroughly because you only saw the dollar signs or the personal benefits of some kind? People have made decisions about jobs just because they look like more pay without considering all the other factors. Or maybe you thought of only the good things and not all of the downside. Kind of like buying a puppy. We've learned. Think about all the fun things, but not all the downside. But nevertheless, you know that repercussions like that can escalate very quickly when you do that. The Bible the Living Bible loosely paraphrases Proverbs 18, verse 13, when it says, "What a shame, yes, how stupid to decide before knowing the facts." Now, of course, the other side of that coin is overthinking, or what we might call analysis paralysis, indecision. Just as we can easily talk ourselves into some bad decisions, we can also talk ourselves out of some potentially good decisions. Moses and Gideon were two guys who kind of strike me as a couple of guys who were very, very indecisive when God approached them. Kept giving reasons and excuses why they didn't want to do it, or talking themselves out of it. They were very indecisive, but eventually, fortunately, they made good decisions. Overthinking breeds indecision. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes 11 that the one who constantly observes the wind, waiting until it's just right, will never get around to sowing the seed. And the one who is waiting for the weather to be perfect at harvest will never get around to reaping. Some of you know exactly what that's like. There are quite a few other factors that really can contribute to a poor decision-making process as well, such as fear of failure, the pressure of a deadline hanging over us, and we just kind of make a decision because we're under the gun, or prejudice or bias that come from deeply rooted and often toxic beliefs. Well, how about this one? When we're in a state of duress or desperation. Does the name Esau ring a bell? Remember the guy who sold his own birthright for a bowl of soup because he was a little more hungry than usual? He wasn't starving. He just felt like he was starving. And in a moment of desperation, he basically gives his birthright and inheritance away. Now the list just goes on and on. When you stop and think about it, with so many challenges to making good decisions, it's a wonder we make any at all, isn't it? It really is. But the final challenge to making good decisions that I want to point out is the one I want to kind of spend the next several weeks addressing. And that is that many people often lack a strong foundational decision-making process. A strong decision-making process is one that is built on having a solid worldview with crystal clear purpose, having healthy filters through which decisions are made, and even having a series of solid questions to consider when making those decisions. Now I'm not talking about everyday decisions, what to wear, what to eat, that kind of stuff. We're talking about major life decisions. And I believe that through a combination of direct commands, strong guiding principles, good stories about and character examples in the scriptures about decision making, and that the work of the Holy Spirit in our life, through all those things, God provides for us a solid path and toxic-free filters to making great decisions. And I also think there are some strong questions that we can begin to ask ourselves when it comes to making some of those bigger decisions we have to make. Now, over the next few weeks, we'll examine many of these principles and these filters and these questions. But for today, there are three foundational decisions that first must be made in order to pursue a path to making better decisions that I want to lay out for us. The first decision that must be made is to make the decision to make better decisions. Now, that sounds catchy and simple. I realize, to make the decision to make better decisions. But really, when you think about it, it's not that easy. To make the decision to make better decisions, typically might think that the decisions you have now are good enough. You have to begin thinking they're no longer good enough. Okay? To make the decision to make better decisions, the decision that you typically might think are good enough can no longer be good enough. To decide to make better decisions going forward requires a healthy dose of humility. Because we must first learn to accept and admit the possibility that the decisions we make do not necessarily make the best decisions, that we can make better decisions. That's not easy because, well, like we already said, the heart is deceitful and pride is a powerful thing. And that means that not only does it take a dose of humility, but it also takes an even stronger dose of honesty with ourselves. If we're going to make the decision to make better decisions, then we need to address the obstacles that are keeping us from doing that. Maybe they're from that list that I just gave us, or maybe there are other reasons. But we have to be honest about the current filters we use to make our current decision. Is sin and selfishness still a major factor in the decisions that you make? Are you selling yourself too easily on the wrong decision? Are you not seeking proper counsel from objective, clear-headed, wiser people that we give room to speak honestly into our decision process? Or do we just listen to those who tell us what we want to hear? Do our decisions lean more on the self-preservation side or the self-sacrificial side of things? Is there a prejudicial bias that is factoring into the decision you and I make? Do we take the time to properly assess the necessary questions and the facts before we make decisions? Well, all these are questions that we need to ask ourselves and answer honestly if we're going to make better decisions that will lead to fewer regrets. Now, I mentioned earlier the puppy, but one thing that's about her that is somewhat kind of annoying for us a little bit is that when she sees or senses something under one of the chairs or the couch, she will stop at nothing to keep digging for it until she gets it. And usually the annoying part of it means that one of us has to get up and get it for her, or at least make it possible for her to get it. In the same way, the path to making better decisions may mean that we have to relentlessly dig for those sometimes hidden negative influences that factor into our current decision-making process. To make better decisions, more God-honoring decisions, means humility, honesty, and hard work need to go into the process. Once we've made the decision to make better decisions, then comes the most important factor that I can mention this morning, and that is to invite God into the decision-making process. Even more, to invite Him to take the lead in that process, including the process of self-examination. As I mentioned earlier, we don't even understand our own heart. Many of us have never taken the time to ask why we think or do the things that we think or do. We buried some of those things so deep from our childhood or other past experiences that we've long since forgotten them or realized just how much of an influence they play in our decision-making process. Others simply chalk their way up of making decisions up to, well, that's just how my parents did it, so that's good enough for me. Honestly, that's a lazy approach to decision-making. That's why sometimes toxic patterns of behavior pass down from one generation to the next. Maybe it's time to be courageous enough to change the family tree, to sit there and say, you know what, maybe there's a better way to make decisions. You know, God has the ability to see into all of that, and more importantly, to help us to look into and change those patterns. The main verse I want to express this morning is a familiar one to many of us, but it's so critical when it comes to making better decisions. You know this verse, right, from Proverbs. It's perhaps the most well-known verse from the entire book. It's Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 and 6, where it says, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight." Now, we've often looked at that verse as a promise or a hope that somehow God will kind of make our path straight by flicking on the proverbial light bulb, so to speak, for each step we need to take in a certain journey that we're on. But what if the way He makes our path straight is more about helping us address and eliminate the negative patterns of thinking and decision-making that is preventing us from having the abundant life that Jesus offers or promised? What if it means that we need to invite God to help us to enlighten those dark, hidden filters in our heart and our mind to help us start asking ourselves better questions? What if it simply means that we need to invite Him to lead our decision process before we ever take the first step in our journey? In Proverbs chapter 16, Solomon writes, "To humans belong the plans of the heart, but from the Lord comes the proper answer of the tongue. All of a person's ways seems pure to them, or seems right to them, but motives are weighed by the Lord. Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and then He will establish your plans." How will He do that? By helping us to examine our own motives, if we're courageous and humble enough to let Him do that. But the hard work to decision-making doesn't stop there. We also must make the decision to pursue the knowledge and the wisdom necessary to making better decisions. Some wisdom comes from time and experience, but much of it comes from pursuing knowledge and understanding. Once again in Proverbs, Solomon wrote in chapter 18, verse 15, that the heart of the discerning acquires knowledge. In other words, the heart of the person who makes better decisions acquires knowledge. For the ears of the wise seek it out. For the follower of Jesus, that means specifically the kind of knowledge and understanding that is born out of a Spirit-led life. According to the words of Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of this knowledge. But fools will despise the wisdom and the instruction. And again in Proverbs chapter 2, verse 6, for the Lord himself gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. Now, over the next few weeks, we're going to dive into all the ways that God provides for us to develop a healthy regimen for making better decisions. But for this week, I just want to challenge us to kind of take some time to ask God to help us humbly and honestly dig deep to discover the things in our own heart and our own mind that prevent us from making better decisions in our life that will ultimately lead to fewer regrets, to less worry, and to healthier relationships. That's the challenge I have for you today. Let's learn to deal honestly with our own decision-making process and say, hey, maybe there's a better way to make decisions. Maybe I need to look inside. What is my filter? How do I make decisions? Is it just because of what I inherited from my parents? Is it because I've asked myself some questions that maybe I need to ask better questions? What is our filter? That's what I wanted to look at for this week. With that in mind, let's have a word of prayer.